Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Theme Camp Symposium breakout room. Today, we're going to talk about conflict. We're going to talk about conflict prevention, engagement, and resolution. And see, we got some folks joining us. And thank you, Sassicat, for putting that note in the chat. We are going to do a couple of presentations for you guys today. I am Papadum, or Adam, and I am a member of the peer support team for Burning Man and a mediator by profession, part-time. And we have a distinguished group of panelists with us as well. We have Justin Papa Smurf, who is also a professional in conflict resolution, teaches at Santa Clara University and is also a member of the peer support team. We have Redbird Bean, and she is coming with some different experience, some experience with VEST and with some the other areas of the virtual burn, as well as experience with managing her own camp, very specific experience. And then we have Rooster, who is a longtime ranger. He's been a ranger for, I think, 17 straight burns. And he's got lots of experience, as you can imagine, having been rangering for all that time. And everyone will give a little bit of an introduction for themselves as well. And we're going to do, Justin and I will each do a short presentation about some skills. After that, we'll have some panel discussions with the four of us, and we'll have time at the end for Q&A. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat, and Sassicat will track those. And we'll try and get to as many as we can. So welcome, everybody. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Papa Smurf.
Thank you so much, Papadum. Welcome, everybody. I'm excited to be here today to talk a little bit about conflict. As Papadum mentioned, my name on the playa is Papa Smurf. My default name is Justin. I teach conflict. I study and work on mediation and conflict management. I have been involved with a number of camps and been to the playa quite a few times. And so I've got some experience that I'm going to bring into my conversation today about what conflict is. And I really want to just frame my presentation around just kind of an understanding of what is conflict and where does it come from. So that's going to be my framework. So let me share my screen and I'll get started. So the conversation that I want to talk with all of you about today is just about what conflict is, really an overview of conflict to give us all a shared framework and understanding and language around conflict as a phenomenon and as an experience that we probably all share. So here's what I'll talk about. We'll talk about what is conflict. We'll look at some conflict styles. I'll talk briefly about power. And then I want to talk about some non-Western approaches to understanding conflict. We'll look at coaching, and then I have some other thoughts as we end. But first, a story. Here, look at these children. Here is a picture of our first year as a camp for Camp Proper. My first camp that I ever started on the playa was Camp Proper in 2015. By 2018, which was our last year on the playa, we had about 35 people in our camp. So we grew pretty dramatically from this small group, this ragtag group, to what we were. It looks like we're all having a blast here. This is about halfway through our first burn. The setup was rough. It was just 3 of us, and we had to get the shade structure, the kitchen, the yurts, all of that set up. After a long drive and a longer wait at the gate, we finally got to camp in the middle of a whiteout condition. I study conflict. One of our group members was very conflict averse, and the other one, let's just say he was conflict engaging. That night, we were barely able to put the yurt together in a very makeshift manner. I'm surprised it actually stayed up the whole night. And we went to sleep. We were pretty beat. We were pretty hungry. The next day, we woke up and we made ourselves some cereal. We started to get to work. During our setup, the friend who was more opinionated than the rest started to push back on everything. He questioned the way that we were setting things up. He argued about the kitchen, how it should be positioned. He even said that the instructions that came with the Costco barn, the kitchen setup, the carport was completely wrong. Things were falling apart quickly, and I was mad. Even though I study conflict, I'm a trained mediator, I've worked through so many more complicated situations, I couldn't recognize what was going on. And in the interest of trying to get the task done, I asked everybody to soldier on. Let's just say it didn't go so well. That afternoon, things reached a breaking point, and we all ended up having to take a pretty extended break from our setup. And we did that alone on the playa. Now, I don't know why I didn't call for a break earlier, why I didn't recognize that what was probably going on was some sort of unmet need, why I didn't sit us all down and talk. I don't have the answer to any of those questions, but from an outside looking in perspective, that would have probably helped the situation. This story might be familiar to you, but or not, but I have a suspicion that based on my time on the playa, that this is pretty common. So today I want to talk about what conflict is. That way we can start to have a shared understanding of the conflict process. And I want to preface this by saying that although I study conflict, I am in no way some sort of conflict guru. I don't think any of us are. We are all living our own human experience and doing our best to understand others. Ultimately, conflict management is about that. So what is conflict? I want you to think of what's the first word that comes to your mind when I say conflict. Now put that word into the chat. And I'm going to tell you on the count of 3, I'm going to ask you to hit enter. So first word that comes to your mind, write it in the chat. At the count of 3, I want you to hit enter. Ready? 1, 2, 3, go. Disengagement, misunderstanding, disagreements, argument, war, fighting. Let's see, what else we got? Fight, miscommunication, frustrations, stress. This all makes sense. Failure to cooperate. Excellent. Give a couple more seconds. Contradiction, friction. It's interesting. I do this same activity, overwhelming. I do this same activity with my undergraduate students, and pretty much the response is the same. Conflict, by the way, is a universal human experience that we often frame in a negative way. And it's one of the ways in thinking about conflict, and really is reflected in all of the things that you've all said, we really think about conflict negatively. Often our association is one where we don't want to engage in conflict. We don't like it. We don't feel that it's good. It's about fighting. It's about those negative emotions. But what if I said that conflict is actually more than just all those negative things? It's really about how we come together to make decisions in many ways. Let's look at one definition of conflict that I find to be particularly useful. An expressed struggle between at least 2 interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference with others in achieving their goals. The definition then includes these parts: that it's an expressed struggle. Conflict really happens when people express their conflict. I'm a communication teacher, so I study how we express conflict. Conflict is about interdependence. If you're not interdependent with another person, you probably don't have conflict with them. And if you did, it wouldn't be really meaningful to you. So in the definition of conflict, it really revolves around the fact that conflict has to be meaningful. There is incompatibility and the potential for scarcity and interference. But the one part about the conflict definition that I think is so critical is that there is the perception of these things. Conflict is not always about a disagreement, about the lack of scarcity of resources. It's not always about incompatibility. It's about the perception that those things exist. Going back to my example of setting up, I bet that there was probably some way to come to an agreement as to we were all on the same page, working together to achieve the same goal. But why is it that we had the perception of an incompatibility? Conflict is natural and beneficial. I know you're probably thinking, wait a minute, we just said all those negative things. How could it be natural and beneficial? It occurs in every relationship. It improves relationships. In fact, there's relational researchers that talk about the fact that one of the turning points in romantic relationships is the first big fight, because at that moment you learn about how your romantic partner is going to deal with conflict. The absence of conflict is a sign of lack of growth. It's how we handle conflict that becomes really important. Conflict, in my mind, I don't believe in the idea of resolution. In fact, resolution is putting an end to the conflict. Management, rather, is finding possible outcomes to a conflict. This is important because we all believe conflict is bad, but really, when conflict is bad, it's bad when we deal with it in a negative way. And that happens when we deal with conflict in a destructive manner. So destructive conflict is where the parties are intent on hurting one another. And the constructive conflict is where there's motivation and productivity. We're trying to work on cohesiveness. We're trying to get through a project together. We're really working collaboratively. Part of conflict is power. Power is the ability to influence others, to control behavior. Oftentimes we frame power in a negative way, but power is a really important component of conflict. It's relational because power is usually embedded in certain kinds of relationships. Your camp leader and the members of your camp, there is a power dynamic there. Power is mostly perceived. There are, of course, real times where power is real, that it's not such a perception of power, but generally speaking, the people who believe that they have power or don't, it's a perception of power. Power can be resource-based, those who have more resources or those who have less. And sometimes you have to exercise power in order to create change. One way of thinking about that is one of my favorite researchers in organizational research, Mary Parker Follet, who argues that power can be viewed in one of two ways. Power over people, that's a threat or force to make people comply, or power with people. The power with people perspective is far more powerful in accomplishing goals because it's about cooperation, the ability to work with others cooperatively to share power. Sometimes power can be in an imbalance. Maybe some people have high power, some people have low power. And thinking about power with others in a framework of trying to manage conflict, that's when we view that we recognize people's disparity in power and say, how can we work on this together? I want to talk about some of the different styles of conflict. And there's a QR code here. You can scan it now if you want and save it on your phone. Otherwise, feel free to take a photo of that. You can also go to that URL. That will take you to the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode instrument. It's for my students. So the first page asks about what class you're in. You can just skip that and go to the second page. It'll score and put you into one of these 5 prototypical Western styles of understanding conflict. We've kind of viewed conflict on these 2 dimensions, a dimension of assertiveness and a dimension of cooperativeness. So how assertive you might be, how cooperative you might be about that particular topic. Those people who are low on assertiveness, low on cooperativeness about a particular topic might avoid a conflict. We view this in lose-lose perspective because nobody wins in that conflict. In thinking about people who are high in cooperativeness but low in assertiveness, they don't value their own perspective, but they value the others. We call that accommodating, giving into the other person. For those people who might be kind of in the middle, kind of a wishy-washy perspective, we call that compromise. Each person has to give up to get to the final goal. Those people who might be high on assertiveness but low on cooperativeness, we would call that a competitive style. So I'm going to try to win and make the other person lose. One of the goal styles, the ultimate goal styles, is a collaborative style. This is a win-win where you're high on your assertiveness. So you have a focus on the problem and you have a high cooperativeness where you're also concerned about the people. That is a collaborative solution. And the collaborative solution is only one where both parties can come to a unique third-party solution together. Now, these are one way of thinking of how we manage conflict. Another way of thinking of how we manage conflict comes from a non-Western perspective. So borrowing an ancient symbol from Taoism, a Chinese philosophy, the Taji, also known as the yin and the yang, is a really powerful metaphor for conflict, especially when we think of it in terms of this non-Western orientation. In fact, I would argue that Westerners reframing conflict in terms of a movement toward harmony is very powerful. The yin and the yang has a lot of symbolism. The yin, or the dark negative, the moon, the passive, the cold, the calm, the internal. The yang, which is the bright, the light, the positive, the direct, the fast, the external. The bend in the middle where the dark and the light meet is called the wuji, or the still point. The calm in the midst of the storm, stillness and movement. The outer circle indicates that all things are made up of yin and the yang. We think of these as complementary, not opposing forces. Moving around the circle shows the natural cycle from the yin to the yang and then back to the yin again. The dots in the middle indicate that there's no absolute yin or yang. Each contains the gem of the other. Harmony, then, is a very powerful way of looking at conflict. Harmony is the maintenance of intricate relationships and complexities in a networked society. From a non-Western perspective, we got those 5 Thomas Kilmann perspectives. Non-Western perspectives include these 8. Constructive diplomacy, where we try to not strain the relationship and we negotiate a solution that enhances the relationship. The accommodating style, maybe taking a small loss to maintain harmony. The constructive controversy style, where there's debate and argument, but we can find a solution that maximizes both parties. The concessional obliging style, where one can decide to make concessions graciously and forego discussion and debate that can involve friction. Superficial compliance, where one can decide to make, when personal goals are high, so the person will appear to just smooth over the dispute and appease the other party with maybe face-saving techniques. This is what I did, I know, during my conflict on the playa. Destructive confrontation, where there's aggressiveness and dominance. These are tactics that maximize returns. Think of this as a competitive style. And then there's the ignoring, where we dismiss the conflict. It's appealing when there's really no concern for a future relationship. And so sometimes ignoring is not a bad solution. It just depends on the context of the conflict. And so I really find these styles to give us a more holistic look at how we can think through conflict and manage them. One good metaphor of thinking about how we work through conflict is not a win or a loss perspective. It's a coaching metaphor. In a coaching metaphor, both parties are trying to help the other achieve success. So we support the other in a process of facilitation. And I'm going to let Adam talk a little bit more about that, where we work with the other person instead of working on them. So again, collectively trying to find a way to come to a good resolution. And I want to end my discussion today just with a couple of final thoughts. And when we think about conflict, a lot of conflict work comes from a perspective of shame, fear, and potentially vulnerability. Really borrowing from the work of Brené Brown, we know that often people's reactions are coming from a place of shame or fear. We tend to see that conflict happens as a defensive posture and really the negative behaviors of conflict to guard against those feelings of shame and fear from others. One antidote to that is to witness that in the other person and then to respond from a place of sincere vulnerability. The key here is to first feel empathy for them by drawing on your own experiences about the situation. Ask yourself, have you ever experienced this? If you're starting out a Burning Man camp and you remember your first time on the playa, you can probably draw to that experience to kind of understand how the other person might be experiencing them. And so really trying to meet people where they are. And I want to end with just as a note that oftentimes we really think of conflict management from really a Western or Eurocentric perspective. And there's a tremendous amount of difference that takes place in various cultures and groups. I would argue that the way we manage conflict on playa is different off playa potentially, and that underscores our difference in culture. So it's important that we don't assume that there's just one right way of managing conflict. I'm hoping that the rest of the presentation today gives you some skills in order to really think through how to manage conflict more effectively. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Papadum now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Papa Smurf. That was great. And again, to those of you who are joining us, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat as we go. So I'm going to jump into sharing my screen. So I just need to verbal that you guys can see this. Yes? Okay, cool. Okay, so I have been camping with Fafa Camp since 2011. We are an international camp. At times we've had 9 different nationalities as part of the camp. We are very focused on being a communalist camp. We eat dinner together every night, followed by a meeting, and that's a requirement to be part of the camp. unless something happens to force you to be removed from that. What we found over the years is it's simply an expectation, and it creates a type of cohesion that's been super helpful for preventing conflict. So there's a reason why I put ground rules up here. If you're heading into a conversation with a group of people where you worry that it might get out of hand, one of the tools you might want to use are ground rules, also called norms. There are various other names for them, but the idea is, how do you build a framework around the conversation so that people will feel safe? Because the bottom line is, if people don't feel safe, they're not going to engage in the way they need to help you work through whatever the issue is. So these are more formal that you might find in a mediation environment, but there are things to just consider talking to people about how they communicate what respect looks like in both the body and the language. And it's important to let people speak without interruption. Especially when folks are antsy or anxious, they tend to interrupt, and trying to get them to be calm and relaxed. This sort of helps to agree to these things. Be hard on the problem and soft on the people. It's human behavior we have issues with. It's generally not the people themselves. And when it devolves into talking about a person based on some sort of list of attributes that they have, you're not going to be resolving the problem. You're creating problem. And it's usually the things that people say or do that is what we're having an issue with. Assume positive intent. Most people do want to resolve. They're bringing their best person to the party here. And then there's a few other that you can add onto there, and there's plenty that you can add later. Okay, and here's a Mark Twain quote, which I love. Good judgment is the result of experience, and experience the result of bad judgment. So sometimes it feels scary to go in and try and resolve conflict between people, and sometimes it won't work. And many of us have had that experience. Any of you who are parents certainly have had that experience. But the reality is, the more you do these kind of things, the better you get at it. So step in early. It's the best thing to do. Another Mark Twain quote. I never said any of that shit. Okay, integrative problem solving. Integrative problem solving is a process that goes behind the scenes of an issue. And basically you're looking for creative, insightful strategies to help resolve the conflict. And this is also called facilitated problem solving and has a few other names, but the idea is to look for what is behind what people are bringing to you. So if you have a conflict going on in your camp or anywhere else, the first thing you hear about is, what is the issue? And they may say, you know, I'm just really angry at that person because they broke my something, or somebody took my parking place, or, you know, whatever the reason is, they bring an issue. And it can be brought by anybody to this. You might bring it up with another party yourself. They're always something that you can see and observe, and it's measurable for the most part. What we're looking for, though, in conflict resolution is the interest, and that is what lies behind the issue that's brought forward. It's the reason why people bring those things forward. It's the reason why people feel the way they feel during the conflict situation. It tends to be intangible. It's a little harder to put your finger on a description. And then finally, when you're working through a conflict, proposals or solutions offered, and sometimes they come early and they undermine people's interests. Like, let's just settle down. Why don't you all just go get a drink and relax? It'll be fine. Okay, there's a proposal to solve that conflict. It probably won't work in most circumstances. So when we're looking for the reason why people are bringing things forward, referred to as interests, they're generally one-word statements, and they reflect needs and values, and they're always positive. So, for example, if you wanted to find an interest for somebody who's come to you and they're angry about someone in the camp doing, you know, whatever it is, and I'll have some examples in a minute, you want to start to find out what the interest is behind that. And so you can ask open-ended questions, such as, what about this is important to you? How will this impact you? Or how will the result of this impact you? What's your greatest concern here? Or what will this mean to you? You're trying to get an answer that will reflect an interest. So Abraham Maslow, many of you may have heard of him, was a famous psychologist who established a hierarchy of needs. And under his description of this hierarchy of needs, there are a number of interests that people bring when they're not meeting their needs, starting with basic physiological needs, the need for food and shelter. There's a need that humans have for safety and security. There is a need that humans have to belong and be loved. And the words you might use are the few that I added here: belonging and appreciation. There's a need to be respected and counted, and you're looking for acknowledgement. Perhaps it's a reputation that's at risk. There's a need to know and understand. And it often is a desire to be included in the conversation and to have their voice heard. And there's also a need for an aesthetic quality in our life. Humans are driven to be creative and expressive. And in a place like Burning Man, this is really the norm more than an exception. It's full of creative people who are trying to express themselves. And often that they may feel thwarted in that expression, and they're trying to reach that aesthetic quality. And finally, there's self-actualization. And this is, I need to be self-directed. I need to be autonomous. And this may be the reason why I'm having an issue here. So then here's some things that you may find in terms of, well, actually, let me reframe this. So if we're looking at, oops, here's a couple of statements. Let's think about what an interest might be for these things. She is so annoying. I wish she'd leave me alone. If you want to pop things in the chat real quick that you think might be an interest there, try and think of a positive word for this. She is so annoying. I wish she'd leave me alone. Any ideas what might be an interest there? Quiet time, solitude, yes. Space, yeah. Independence, belonging and acknowledgement, rest, yeah. Could be all of the above. So, and how about the next one? How come no one asked me? I don't know if anybody's ever heard that in their camp before, but belonging. What else might be a reason there? Inclusion, yeah. Not feeling heard, yeah. And that's telegraphed pretty well by how come no one asked me? Yeah, recognition, voice, exactly. All right, how about the next one? You need to shut down those speakers now. Sleep, yes. It's a basic physiological need. Yeah, been there indeed. I think a lot of us have heard that one before. Okay, we're going to move on just for time. Got a few more slides to get through. Okay, there's a concept also in looking at conflict called DIVE, which stands for Describe, Interpret, Verify, and Evaluate. And a reality about dealing with people who you may be in conflict with or trying to resolve conflict for people is that often if you jump to interpretation immediately, we make assumptions about why people behave a certain way. If you're incorrect about it or perceived as incorrect about it, the other party will feel like they've been insulted perhaps, and it will actually make your conflict worse. So you want to start with a description. So a lot of times it's most important to say, I saw that you were doing the following. Tell me a little bit about that. Or I heard you yelling across the camp at so-and-so for something. I'm not sure what's going on. Can you tell me, is there an issue here? You know, something like that. Once they describe and you understand what it is that's going on, then you can start to question in terms of interpreting, like, is this making you feel bad? Or how does it make you feel to go through this? Is there something ongoing here that we need to know about? You may need to verify what they tell you by checking with other people in the camp. Have you heard, have you seen, has this been your experience too? And then finally, you evaluate from which you decide an action. This is what appears to be the case. Let's move on this. So we have to be careful with this because we are incorrect a lot in interpreting what's going on with another person. And I can guarantee that every person that's here today has felt misunderstood and misinterpreted when you've been in a conflict with somebody else. It happens all the time. So one of the skills is to learn to not do that and instead try to describe. So here's some examples. I saw that when he said that, you rolled your eyes. What was that about? So that's describing it as opposed to saying, you know, what are you all pissed off about? which is an interpretation. Sometimes people roll their eyes and they're saying like, oh, isn't she such a silly goose, or something like that, which isn't really angry. It can be misinterpreted. So if you said something, why are you so mad at her? Did you say that you feel she's being unfair, is a way to verify. If you interpret, first you describe, then if you interpret and the person confirms your interpretation, then verify. If it's that the person is feeling that she's being treated unfairly, is this how you felt? Verify that. And then finally, you can get to, I understand you feel she's being unfair and unseen. This must make you feel bad. And it's a way to confirm that feeling, evaluate that this is true, and then you can move on from there to some suggestions for resolution. Okay, let's see how we're doing for time. Got a couple more minutes. I'm going to move through to, satisfactions. If you are having meetings in your camp, and a lot of us have meetings in our camp, and usually they are just business as usual, but every once in a while, it's problem solving. And if it is problem solving, you want to think about a couple of things getting there. One is, how do you set up so that people feel better about, sorry, let me start at the beginning. How do you set the meeting up so that people feel satisfied with the way it was put together? So how do you invite people to the meeting? How do you define what you're going to talk about? How do you get your information together to figure this out? And then when you're talking and you come up with an answer at the end, you want to check with people and say, did this work for you? Have we resolved this? Are you feeling like the problem's behind us and we can move on, or at least we understand it more deeply so we can manage it? You're looking for a solution where each party says, this works for me. And that can be you and one other person. It can be a camp of 40 people. Sometimes these things happen. And then finally, do people feel better? And one of the things we do really well at Burning Man is we break bread, we share food, we share drink. That could be a ticket to camaraderie with people. And I have a story to tell you about this one. A couple of years ago at the last burn, we camped next to a very large camp, and they were setting up just a beautiful dome next door. And we were watching this whole thing go up together, and we were building our more standard camp. We're a camp of about 45 people. And at a certain point, they had a huge refrigerator truck and the generator ran all night. And it kept the camp up the whole night. It was very hard to sleep. And people hemmed and hawed. And the next morning, people got up and they talked about how angry they were at these people next door who weren't sensitive enough to turn off the truck compressor. And so we talked about it, and they were like, "Oh, these people, they're so awful, and they have no idea what it's like to be a good neighbor," and blah blah blah, talking about that. And I said to them, "We need to go and talk to them only about how we feel. We have no idea where they're coming from, or what happened here. Let's just go do that." So I grabbed another one of the camp leaders, and we went over and found the camp leader over there and just said, "Hey, we just want to tell you, we had a hard time sleeping last night. We were feeling just disturbed because your compressor was on all night. It was really loud." And the camp leader was so mortified that for the next 6 days, they brought us food every day and invited us over to go in there. And they just kept saying, "We're so sorry, we're so sorry." And so we worked out a thing. They had a refrigerated truck. They feed 400 people. They had we agreed they could turn it off from midnight till 6 a.m. and it wouldn't harm the food. And it worked beautifully. To this day now, 3 years later, we're friends with these people in that camp. So, it's amazing what you can do with little work there. All right, I'm going to talk about one more thing, and then I'm going to let it go. I could go on and on, but we've got our panelists to get to. And I want to talk about neutral reframing. Part of this is that there's a way to talk about things that keeps the language neutral. And you want to think about this when you're addressing a conflict between two other people or between you and someone else. How do you get the emotionally charged language out of that? And sometimes you have to think very carefully before you approach and speak. First of all, if you think again, we're going to be hard on the problem, but soft on the person, you want to avoid saying you too much. It's very much more helpful to use I statements and say, "I feel such and such when this particular thing happens." People are more respectful when you speak about how it's impacting you as opposed to blaming somebody else. So neutral reframing is that somebody may say that person's a real jerk, and you might reframe the language too and say, would you consider saying something like, I'm really having a hard time with the things that person was doing yesterday. It's a more neutral stance. It isn't attacking. There's a lot more in this that we could go into if we had more time, but I think that's about it. So I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to invite people to put anything in the chat from either Papa Smurf's or my presentation that you may want to know more about later. But I think now we're ready to move on to our panel. Here we are. Got a series of questions to ask, but first what I'd like to do is let's just talk about the camps that we're with or with most recently, and about your, just sort of a brief thing, who you are, what's your camp, what you're bringing today. Let's start with Redbird Bean.
Hi, my name is Redbird Bean, also known as Sarah Pugh. My camp is Land of Monkey. We're in the 730 sector, that's sometimes also known as the Queerborhood. Usually we have about 35 to 50 people in our camp. And what I'm bringing today is my experience with VEST, which is the virtual experience support team that worked with all the different virtual Burning Man experiences in 2020 and 2021. That was really built with, virtual rangers, virtual Playa Info, and virtual Temple Guardians to support our community in digital spaces. And then I'm also bringing the fact that I'm one of the camp leads at Land of Monkey, and we have some of our own ways that we handle conflict. But also now we're starting to also integrate kind of the digital experience and integrating our community and virtual spaces before we even get to Playa.
Great.
Thank you,
Redbird Bean. Rooster.
Hi, my name is Rooster, and I've been a burner since 2001 and a ranger since 2003 and a green dot ranger since 2008. And the green dot is the special trained rangers that help people with what I call experiential emergencies. Also on Playa, I am the lead for a team of rangers called the art car wranglers that help place the art cars during the Man and Temple burns, as well as the some of the smaller, mid-sized large burns that happen on the other nights. And we have to bring a deft hand of conflict resolution, because the things that we get are, they're blocking our view. We got here 2 hours ago. They just rolled up and they think they get the spot. So we answer a lot of calls and have to settle things like that. Also in default, I work as a patient advisor with the UC San Francisco. And I also worked on the state's, California's state COVID response program for contact tracers, and as well as vaccine outreach workers, where I helped train people on the delicate task of persuasion to encourage people to get the vaccine.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rooster. Papa Smurf, do you want to say anything more by way of introduction, or do you want to get right to questions? You choose.
Well, yeah, let's get to the questions. I know we've got some, and there's some that are coming in on the chat that I've seen too.
Okay, all right. So the first question is, how can camps prepare internally to prevent conflict? Who wants to go first?
I can speak to this a little bit. So one of the ways that we prepare, even when we're recruiting campmates. So anybody that's coming into our camp that's interested in our camp first fills out an application form that's relatively thorough. And we talk there about the principles. We talk there about the expectations of the camp. We also have meals in our camp. We have a brunch and a dinner in our camp every day. And as a camp member, you're asked to provide one of those meals with another campmate or two. And then for the rest of the week, you're getting fed by all the meals that everyone else has made. So in addition to getting fed, it's also a touchstone for us and the camp leads team to come together with the campmates and see how it's going. And you're not required to be at those meals, that we ask that you try to make at least one of those meals a day. So we know that you're coming back to your to your home, that you're getting replenished with your supplies, that you're safe, that you're healthy, all of that stuff, because there's a lot of shiny things and a lot of distraction. And then we also, all of our campmates are also have other requirements at camp. We have several different teams. And the nice thing about our teams is not only do you have these requirements, but that's another camp lead that is kind of keeping an eye on if somebody's able to make their commitments or what's going on with them and that kind of thing. So it all kind of ties together. So myself and another camp member are what we call, formerly we called it like HR, but now we call it burner success. So folks know that they can come to us, but we also have the meals where people can come to us. And then sometimes we also aren't in the place where we can handle the conflict because we're having our own challenges. And that's when it's very helpful, because we also have a mayor of the day, and then the other camp leads that might be able to help support a conflict resolution. And it's not just put on one person.
Thanks. Thank you, Redbird Bean. Okay, anybody else want to take on that one?
Yeah,
All right,
yeah, go on.
so go ahead, Rooster. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I don't have much to say about that. The application beforehand is a great idea. Getting information like power needs and footprint and things like that, special things so that you can map out some sort of an idea of where people are gonna be. I've noticed that every large camp has, it's all small little neighborhoods and people tend to cluster together. At least that's been my experience. And so people tend to self-separate for peace because who really wants to camp next to somebody who's like causing a problem? And people are free to move within the camp. I don't know if I mentioned I'm the camp host, and it's a ranger camp, Camp Moscow. So it's kind of a working camp. So we would all hope to be reasonable people since we are rangers after all.
That's great. Let me just throw in quickly about Fafa Camp. So we have a dinner before camp starts every year. And during that time, we talk about expectations and we talk about what we sort of would like to see. And it's not very heavy. We keep it pretty light, but we do communicate to folks, and we do this all the way up until we actually arrive on the playa, an expectation of certain things that people are going to do. And it's a certain amount of time committed to the well-being of the camp to keep it functioning. Every single person has 3 chores a week to do. And we have a board at the beginning that has everybody's assignment on it. And we have 2 mayors, and the mayor's job is to just encourage everybody to do the job they're signed up for and to help track them down if they don't show up. And the last couple of years, we've also identified people in the camp to deal with internal issues. For example, we had one person who was going to deal just with consent issues. And knowing that that can be a problem both in and between and from outside camp. And then someone else who was identified to deal with any strife that happened between us and any neighbor camps. And I think we learned it from that last year's experience. So we do have a couple of questions also. So first one is, when there is a lack of safety or capacity to facilitate conflict resolution internally, to have previously identified folks outside the camp village who can help mediate. What is the panel's thoughts on it, and what are some ideas or ways in asking external folks for support in that situation? Anybody want to take that on?
Well,
I was gonna say, I think looking to outside resources is one option, right? And I was gonna maybe, I don't want to step on your toes, Rooster, because I know that from a ranger perspective, maybe you can speak to kind of how that process looks too.
I was going to say it's always great to see if an issue can be resolved from within, but I know that when you seek the external thing, the rangers tend to be the default. And that's okay, it's what we signed up for. And we spend a lot of time training in different conflict resolution scenarios. So it's okay to call us. And basically what we do, you know, first of all, for the two papas, great stuff. Your presentation is neat, both of you. I was writing down notes, and I like those kinds of was it acronyms? You know, like the DIVE, things like that. Rangers have something sort of similar to that in the way that when we come into situations, how we try to mediate them. And it very much sounds an awful lot like describe, interpret, verify, and evaluate. Except ours are a little more ranger tuned. We call it FLAME, FLAME. So F is to find out, and you find out by L, listening. And so you just listen to, well, let's go back to find out. So you find out by not only, we have this thing called first do nothing, which is to walk in on a situation and just to observe, just to watch what's going on. And listening comes in as people will come up to you and talk to you and describe, and you use your eyes to see, to read body language and position of things that's going on. You know, you listen for that loud camp sound or the generator or whatever. And then after drinking in the entire situation, the A is to analyze the situation. And it's very much taking that balance of digging deeper, because it's like one of the things that we train the rangers on is that what's on the surface oftentimes is not the issue. It's something deeper. Like that thing about the noisy camp. Well, it's denying somebody their sleep, you know, or whatever, you know. So that's like a great example. There's a lot of noise complaints. Mediate. We were called to solve an issue. So our thing is to help the parties to their own best resolution. So in other words, we're not trying to solve the problem for anybody. We're trying to help them put all their issues on the table. And us as a neutral party that does not have a stake in the outcome except to find peace within everybody can just say, I'm hearing this, I'm hearing that, what do you think of this? How about if we do that? And it's important that we do this on that, and that explain. That's the last part. FLAME. The E is explain, and that's what it is. You say, I'm hearing this. You know, what if we can do this over here? Will that help resolve it? And the thing about us as mediators, our value is because there's something that we actually teach. Another one that we teach is that the hardest conflict to resolve is the hardest issue to ranger is your own. And that's why it's okay that, I mean, you know, rangers, we're human. We have camp dramas, we have things. And so sometimes we need a third party to step in. And so sometimes we have to ranger our rangers. So yeah, that explains what the rangers do. And how you can find us, sometimes, most definitely you'll see us walking in pairs throughout the city. And if you need something more direct, we have a ranger headquarters, which is just off of Center Camp. It's to the left as you're facing Center Camp, if you're standing out in the playa. And we also have outposts at 3 o'clock and at 9 o'clock.
Great. Thank you, Rooster. That was super helpful. Any other thoughts on looking for external supports? And I know other than rangers, what else do we have in terms of external supports, if anything?
Can I offer up? Okay, there's also in a lot of things that happen in some camps are issues with, like you said, consent, and just, you know, people that kind of creep out other people. And for some people, it's like, well, I can avoid this person, but I still feel unsafe and I need to talk to somebody. So there are two sources of support for that. One, well, the main helpful source is Sanctuary, which is at Rangers headquarters. And that is where we kind of offer a quiet space and allow somebody to talk their thing out with somebody that they can choose. In other words, they want to speak to a man and they want to speak to a woman, they can find someone who can help them decompress through an issue.
Right. That's great. And we can talk in a bit about what do you do when you have people in crisis, because there are various other things on Playa for dealing with folks in crisis. The questions that popped up in the chat seem to be more about, we're having issues within our camp. What do we do about that? So the first one, again, that was about what are the thoughts about external folks supporting you and perhaps mediating. I think it's a great idea if you have another camp that you're familiar with that's nearby, and you may work out a role for whoever might be inclined towards that and have some experience with mediating conflict, to be the person to go to should you not be able to resolve it yourself. I think it's a great idea if you have somebody like that. But I think the best solution is to train yourselves. I mean, there's plenty of opportunity to learn these skills. They're easy to find on the internet, and we can pop some resources, I think, in the chat as we go. And some of them have been around for decades. There's a classic book called Getting to Yes, which is one of the foundations of facilitated conversations, mediation, and negotiation. And it's just really great. Covers a lot of the stuff, pretty simple, very helpful in any conversation. So that's one idea. The next question has to do, well, what do you do with before conflict descends? How do you prep your camp, basically, so that how do you facilitate a camp conversation so that you have a shared understanding about how to handle future conflict? And I know that Redbird Bean talked about that a little bit, and I talked about that a little bit in terms of setting up. Any other thoughts about that? What else can we do to form a shared understanding on how to handle future conflict within a camp?
I do have a few more things to share. One is that although myself and another campmate are like the point people if you need to come to someone, we have a very diverse leadership team, and people do know that they can go to the person that they're most comfortable with. Because what if their conflict is with me? What if they're not comfortable with me? What if they have other issues that they might feel more comfortable going to someone else too. So one is really communicating, what your options are, and that we have an open line of communication, and that we have like these regular touchstone moments that I talked about earlier. Another one, a very practical application, is we have a use of like a community safe word. So basically whenever anyone says pineapple, it's like, they need 5 minutes, or they need for you to take a step back, or they need to like get water, or it's just a moment to like, let's come into our bodies and maybe like take a minute because you're feeling a little pressed, or whatever it is that you are feeling. It's a moment for us to kind of come together. And so I feel like that really, and we also can use pineapple in a joking way, and like, let people know that it's okay to kind of express when you're starting to feel a little off center. And then of course it's have you eaten, have you drank water, do you need to take a break, have you slept? All of that, the basics, the very, very basics are really kind of the cornerstones of that prevention, I feel like. One other key for us, I would say, is that people do have expectations. Like they were talking about the chart of when you're responsible for a thing and you are being held accountable, and that helps too. That you do have to kind of stay tethered to time and space on a certain level, because you are expected to be responsible for things, and that can also help people we're all operating at Burning Man with having some expectations of our time, and so that there's a certain kind of vibe in our community that's expected, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Redbird Bean.
I was going to say real quick, don't let the first time you talk about conflict be on the playa. I think it's really critical to have these conversations in advance. Talk about what might happen. Talk about who you might turn to. Talk about the kinds of conflicts that you could possibly have on the playa. And it even, I mean, in our camp, we even went so far as doing some role plays to walk through what might you do in that situation. It sounds silly, but I think just having that as a place to turn back to when the conflict does happen, because it will turn back to that, because that does set the expectations very clearly.
Rooster.
I want to say that, a lot of camps have a continuing roster of people year to year. And so there's some way of keeping, the institutional knowledge of, what people don't like about each other and sort of pre-plan for that. So maybe you schedule people so they don't cross their paths or put them on opposite ends of the camp, and just remember all that so that just like Papa Smurf was saying, you can talk, in that planning meeting beforehand, these are the kind of things that can get planned out so that once you hit the playa, it's like, oh, you're over here, they're over there. You got your way of getting out, they got theirs.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rooster. I also want to point out that one of the things that I know from working with the peer support team is that there are plenty of folks who allow people to continue in their camps, even though they know those people create a lot of conflict for them. And I think one of the things you want to ask yourself is, how safe do I want my camp? Am I okay with a certain level of conflict? And are the other members of the camp okay with a certain level of conflict? There are some people who they don't mind getting in fights periodically. It's like, fine, it doesn't really ruin their experience. But for other folks, it does. And it's a pretty tough question to say, you know what, I'm not sure that person's really contributing here. And I know that in our camp, we had to have a come to Jesus meeting with some folks and just said, you got to stop this. It's really destructive and nobody likes it. And if you can't figure out how to do that, we really can't allow you to continue with the camp. They chose to leave. And it turned out to be great. They ended up creating their own camp the following year, and it was no problem. And we rested a lot easier as a result. That's part of it. It leads me to the next question that somebody asked, which is, how do you deal with conflict when it's happening in the middle of your camp? So if you got two people going at it, or they're giving each other the major silent treatment and they're not going at it, but it's everybody knows it and it's creating a rift. And once again, let's go back to not waiting, as Papa Smurf said, don't wait till you're on the playa to figure out how to manage conflict. Do some training ahead of time, learn some basic steps, and then you can get in there and you can begin to use those steps with people to try and resolve that conflict. I would say, first of all, you want to make it clear that it's not acceptable within your camp, that you have to find another way to deal with each other because it's creating pain and suffering for people in the camp. And if you're all speaking the same language because you've talked about it before the event starts, then you're going to be in much better shape for resolving conflict when everybody knows that this is what's going to happen. And if you can identify people to be those leads, more power to you. It's great. Burners tend to be really curious people, willing to learn. Well, find those people in your camp that are willing to learn how to be conflict preventers. Okay, so we got a couple more questions. We do have
I was going to say too on that.
Sorry.
I really love Redbird Bean's idea of a safe word. I think when the heat happens, taking a step back and cooling things down is one of the best solutions. I study how our bodies respond to conflict. And what happens, of course, is you get that stress response, and that stress response then leads to a worse engagement in conflict. And so if you do feel that heat happening, where the conflict is escalating, to use a term from getting to yes, go to the balcony, take a moment, calm down, and then come back when you're able to have a more cognitive response to the conflict as opposed to that embodied emotional response.
Great point. And I like the fact that apparently pineapple is a common safe word. So
you could use pumpkin. I've done that.
That's great. That's great. Thanks so much for that. Oh, by the way, Papa Smurf, I wanted to mention something that you mentioned, Mary Parker Follett. One of my favorite quotes from her is, Um, all polishing comes from friction, right?
Yeah, that's
So the
a
idea,
great quote. Yep.
so you talk about how conflict is so essential to understand. It's just an essential part of being a human, and that conflict allows us to hone our relationships and really improve them and move them forward. Okay, got time for a couple more questions. A few of us started a new spin-off camp. I'm the main camp lead and I'm a young Latina woman. The other camp leads are older white men who have been going to Burning Man longer than I have. Any tips on navigating this and how not to step on others' toes? Who would like to take that one?
This to me feels like that perspective of power that I kind of talked about too, and how that's embedded, and it's embedded in very strange ways, right? In the way that people feel ownership of certain kinds of experiences and certain kinds of spaces. And I think it's tricky to navigate that, right? And I think your experience, I think, is absolutely a valid one. One way that I would recommend is maybe turning to folks in the community who are touchstones for you, and that could help give you some skills and helping in working on communicating with those other people. It's hard to kind of give specifics without really truly understanding the dynamic, but I think that maybe turning to mentors or other people in the community that can really focus on that would be helpful.
I think another thing that could be really helpful is kind of clarity of roles. So if you're the camp lead and these are co-leads, what are their kind of areas that they have ownership over? You know, so we have someone over water, we have someone over electric, we have someone over our community space, we have someone over our kitchen. And so I think kind of defining roles, and you know, sometimes things get blurry, but in terms of toe stepping, and if that's something that you're worried about, kind of being clear on those things can be helpful. And thank you so much for heading up a camp. It is a lot of work. And you know, I also suggest that you ask for help when you need it, and even before you need it. Like the other camp leads for my camp as well are men. And some of the men that are also leads take part in other processes. Like I'm also on the board of Queer Burners. And I bring that up because one of the things that Queer Burners is doing is like kind of doing a self-assessment of like where we are in terms of ride. And so people on our team are willing to be self-reflective, not just of themselves, but kind of organizationally reflective of how an organization is operating. And so we also bring that knowledge and that education and that work we're doing to be more inclusive and more supportive and all that kind of stuff into our camp culture as well, and our leadership culture. And so you know, there might be opportunities like that. There's a ton of right information on Hive, and you can encourage the other camp leads to also check that out. I'm going to encourage all of our camp to go take time with those resources.
Yeah, I can appreciate the challenge that's facing you being a young Hispanic woman, Latino woman, and your co-leads are two older white men with more experience. And there's all kinds of things that they can subconsciously hold over you. The big one is, I've been doing this way longer than you. And then, you know, the unspoken thing is, I'm a white man. And it's perfectly natural to be sensitive to those kinds of dynamics. And I hope that they are too. And it may be what we call an educational opportunity if you feel that they are in some way belittling your lack of experience, or the fact that you're a woman, or the fact that that you're non-white. You know, you may have to point that out in a as gentle a way as you possibly can without provoking them. I say these things all the time, that Burning Man, if you're open to it, holds a huge mirror up to yourself. And you will find yourself reflected back to yourself, whether it's you holding the mirror or somebody else holding it for them. And if it must be you that holds up that mirror, remember, you're behind the mirror. They are seeing themselves. Okay. So there is power in being able to do that. And if they are self-reflective enough, they will see that. And it will be such a learning moment at a time, and they need to learn this moment. So I hope you find that encouraging. The power is within you and within the people that support you in your camp. And if you need to find another white man to help interpret, translate for them, by all means, encourage them to stand by you. So good luck.
Yeah, that was great. I think what I'm going to go back to again for your question about this new camp and dealing with older white men, or just that cultural and also age conflict, is build your skills. I think that we'll just say it again and again, is build your skills, because it'll help you with everybody dealing with these people who believe they have all the answers from their place of privilege, or from folks who just don't want to have the conversation or don't even understand there's a problem here. And how do you get there is just build your skills, learn how to approach people in a way that they're more likely to hear you than not. And once you've gained their ears, then you can start to explore things that may be more sensitive topics. And sometimes it takes a while with people. And I think, again, those of you who are parents, if you've had adolescents, and you know how you have to walk an adolescent through sometimes just saying no to everything, or as part of their normal development to start to differentiate from you by objecting to things and maybe being difficult. People are who they are, and allowing them to have their own culture, their personal culture, while also trying to resolve conflict takes a little bit of work and practice, but I think it's really worth it. So grab those resources and see what you can do there. Okay, anyway, thanks everybody for that. We have a couple of minutes left. Looks like, okay, Generator, you got some people direct message you for some resources. That's great. That's great. And that's the thing about this community, is there are a lot of resources. So I think that's the last question, because we have to stop right at 2:30. What resources would you recommend, panelists, for folks to read, to review, to check out?
Well, the Ranger Handbook is public on the Burning Man website. Anybody can review it. You can learn more about flame there. That's something that I've read, and it's also encouraged for our leads to review. We also try to have a ranger in our camp every year, at least one. We also have a radio that we test, that we know we can get like the general response number, just for kind of internal on fire resources. Another thing that I think is, it's a little bit off this question, but I think is important to reiterate, which is what Charlie Dolman mentioned in the keynote, which is we're encouraging our camp members to not have Burning Man be the first time they've been in a large group of people. I'm going to a regional burn partly to practice being around many people for many days. So I've spent, most of the last two years with my dogs and my husband, and that's not being around many beings. And then going for a week where, there's almost no privacy, is a very big change. And so I think it's important too, that we kind of practice and get comfortable or have those feelings about what it's like to be out in community.
Yeah, thanks for that point. And I think that as we're going to continue to struggle with COVID as an aspect of conflict as well, in terms of feeling safe and comfortable in certain circumstances. And you do have a good deal of control once you're on the playa about where and who you interact with, but not always. And sometimes people won't respect the same space that you respect. And so there are plenty of opportunities for conflict. So how do you keep yourself safe through those things? So,
You know, one tip
yeah.
out there on the playa, and if you want to talk to somebody, just kind of take note of wind direction. And just if both of you kind of stand with the wind blowing between you, there's not a problem with the, you know, and in a stiff wind, that's not a problem at all. And I tell people I'm going to hug them. I just tell them to hold their breath, and I hold my breath and we hug.
Great. Thank you, Rooster. So I think we're out of time, you guys. I want to thank you guys so much for being here. Thanks to the panelists, Rooster, Redbird, Bean. Thanks, Papa Smurf, for your great presentation. Thanks to everybody who joined us today. And Sassy Cat, thank you so much for monitoring the chat and helping to forward questions. Really appreciate it. And El Leon, thank you for being our tech moderator and helping me figure out my own tech issues trying to get into this in the first place. So again, I just want to thank everybody, and hopefully we'll all see each other on the playa.
Yay. Thank you
Okay,
all.
thank you so much. Good luck,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Right.
Everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
See
Safe
you on the
travels
duff.
to the playa. Yeah.